about to meet two descendants of two very famous men. This is all about Munson's Hill at Bailey's Crossroads during the Civil War that was occupied by General J.E.B. Stuart for 6 weeks and held attention throughout the world. On my right here is Colonel J.E.B. Stuart, United States Army retired. And over there is Munson Lane, Jr., great-great-grandson of the owner, Timothy Munson of Munson's Hill. I'm going to tell you just a little bit again about Munson's Hill. It was the closest fortification that the South had ever in the United States throughout the Civil War to Washington, D.C. It fooled the Union with these guns that were Quaker guns. They weren't real guns. And McClellan was frightened and never invaded because he thought there were thousands and thousands of men up there because he sent up a balloon and he was misinformed. So we have over here a Munson supporter family of Lincoln and of course J.E.B. Stuart, who was a hero and still a living hero of the South. And I would like, first of all, for you to tell us, Mr. Munson, how did your great-great-grandfather acquire that hill?
Mr. Munson came with his family from Leicester, New York in 1851. The reason for their coming is that apparently his wife was in ill health and they wanted to find a warmer climate for his wife. She died the year after they arrived at Munson Hill. Upon their arrival, they began farming operations, raising grain and sheep, and starting a nursery. The operation eventually grew into a sizable nursery that was marketing fruit and nursery products all over the United States. At one time, there were 40 agents throughout the United States, and the nursery employed about 20 persons who attended the nursery.
And how many acres was there?
There were 260 acres. Most of that land at that time was, including Munson Hill, and was north of the Alexander-Leesburg Turnpike.
Now I'd like you to tell us a little bit, because you were so close to him, and to the history of your great-grandfather. Just tell me a little bit about him.
He was born in a county that's now called Patrick County in Virginia. And his birthplace is only a mile over the North Carolina line. He came from a large family with 3 other brothers and 6 sisters. His father was Archibald Stuart, who was a member of the General Assembly in Virginia and also served as a representative in the U.S. Congress. Having 3 older brothers, I'm sure that J.E.B. was introduced very early to the art of horsemanship. And interestingly enough also, he was named after a dear friend of his father, Judge James Ewell Brown, and hence the name James Ewell Brown Stuart, shortened to J.E.B. Stuart.
I love J.E.B.
He grew up in a country atmosphere in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was sent to Emory and Henry College, and was there 2 years, and had a great religious influence throughout his early childhood, mostly from his mother, and that religious influence was reinforced at Emory and Henry, which was a Methodist college. He received an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy and matriculated there in 1850, graduated in 1854, was assigned to the Mounted Rifles in Texas initially, and then was selected as a junior officer, 2nd lieutenant, in the formation of the 1st Cavalry Regiment at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. And saw a lot of service and a lot of combat in the West prior to the beginning of the Civil War, when he resigned his commission from the federal forces in April of 1861 and accepted a lieutenant colonelcy in the Confederate Army.
I see. Okay, now let's get back to Mr. Munson, and I would like to know a little bit about his relationship with President Lincoln, because right before J.E.B. Stuart takes that hill, what happens?
Timothy Bishop Munson, having come from New York, was a Northern sympathizer, and he was a Republican. During the campaign for Abraham Lincoln's first campaign for the presidency, he apparently was a supporter of his, and at the time of the election, November 1860, he and 7 other men went armed to the ballot place, which at that time required that you verbally, it was not secret ballot, they had to tell who they were voting for. That's the reason for their going armed. He voted for Abraham Lincoln, and because they voted for Abraham Lincoln, most of those people then went into Washington, where they were
a little bit safer.
A little bit safer.
Tell me a little bit about J.E.B. Stuart and why he loved the South so. I mean, why it was so instilled in him.
Well, I believe he developed a great love for the state of Virginia, and I'm sure was caught with a terribly difficult decision, as many other Southerners were, when things started to unravel in the early 1860s. And having been a product of the military academy at West Point and instructed and imbued with the idea of upholding the Union, I'm sure that was a terribly pulling force in opposition to his love of the state of Virginia and his concern for the independence of the state of Virginia. He did make that difficult decision, as Robert E. Lee did and many others had to do. In the process of making the decision, he created some division. There were some serious divisions within the family. His wife was the daughter of an Union Army general who was a commander of cavalry, who was a Virginian. His name was Philip St. George Cooke, and he decided to throw his allegiance and loyalty to the United States. And when they named their first child, my grandfather, they named him Philip St. George Cooke Stuart. But of course, when they found out that his wife's father was going to remain with the Union, they renamed him J.E.B. Stuart II. So you can see that the emotions were running very high.
It's been real hard on the wife, I think. And someone in the Munson family, one of the sons, what happened with him?
Yes, the oldest son, Timothy Bishop, Jr., went to Louisiana in 1858 and was overseer of a plantation there. In 1862, he was drafted into the Confederate Army and fought at the Battle of Vicksburg and was taken captive at that time under the conditions of of his capture. He had to stay behind the Union lines and remain there until at the end of the war.
So both cases are an example of how our country was families were so divided. So tell me a little bit more about your family's relationship with Lincoln.
Timothy Bishop apparently knew Lincoln or was acquainted with him. During the year, or the fall and winter of 1860, 1861, Mr. Munson was asked to consult with Abraham Lincoln and General Scott, and apparently he did this on several occasions. I have no idea what the consultation was about. You only can speculate.
Didn't they say something about he wanted to know what the terrain was for battle?
This is what I would speculate.
Yeah,
he probably wanted to know what the sentiment of the people out here was and what the terrain was around Munson's Hill.
And your family was very friendly with the Lees, which was sort of equal, not quite the president, but the hero of the South. And how was that, J.E.B. Stuart, related to, in relationship to Lee?
When J.E.B. Stuart went to West Point as a young cadet, the superintendent of the military academy at that time was then Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. And of course, Colonel Lee had a large family, and Stuart came to admire him greatly. That was his first introduction to the Lees and to the Lee family, and he enjoyed meeting his daughters, and he also enjoyed the relationship he had with Lee's son and Lee's nephew.
And they fought with him.
Yes.
I was reading about how they were all so very close, the Lees and the Stuarts.
Very much intertwined, yes.
Really in history. And what was this about Lucy in the diary, which is so exciting, that she goes to President Lincoln for a job, something like that?
The Munson diary, or Miles Munson diary, which is recorded in the Munson Record, published in 1896, tells a story about Lucy Munson and her brother going for an interview with Abraham Lincoln in December the 13th, 1861. There are several accounts of this. The one I like most is one that was written by Lucy Munson's husband, who was then president of Worcester College in Columbus, Ohio. He tells of the story that Mrs. Lincoln invited Lucy Munson to come to her room in the White House the day before she actually went to see Mr. Lincoln, and which she did, and then she arranged with Mr. Lincoln that Lucy and her brother meet Mr. Lincoln in the personal quarters at the White House. They went to see Lincoln and asked that Ms. Lucy Munson be given a position. Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter, a copy of which we have now in possession, in which he wrote to the Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Chase, asking that he see Miss Lucy and her brother, who had driven out from Munson Hill, and that she be given employment. Apparently she didn't receive the employment, but at least the president was gracious enough to see it.
But she had a letter from the President of the United States. But I'd like to know a little bit more about one of my heroes, who was the dashing, daring cavalier, they called him, J.E.B. Stuart. Tell me more about his cavalry methods and things like that.
I look at him really in two respects. I think that he provided a sense of assertiveness, euphoria about the possibility of the Confederate States fulfilling their mission. He was one of a few who provided a sense of humor and some comic relief, I think, in another otherwise pretty desperate situation in the conflict between the two forces. On the other side, I reflect upon him as probably being one of the first individuals to recognize that the role of cavalry was changing. There were proponents at that period that felt that the essence of cavalry was the charge. And I think when you look at that in terms of the technological advances of that time, with the cone-shaped bullet and rifling concept that added tremendous amount of range to rifles, the idea of the cavalry charge was rather ludicrous. And I think that Stuart, in his studies and his reflection and his experience in the West, decided in his own mind that the role of cavalry was distinctly changing. And he thought and applied his forces in such a way that they were used in stealth, reconnaissance, denial operations, and things that don't involve the clashing of cavalry against infantry or cavalry against cavalry. And I think that he brought a whole new dimension to American warfare, and that dimension has remained intact as we look at our cavalry units today, and the fact that their mission today is reconnaissance, denial, and security operations. And I think that that showed his insightfulness at that time.
And I want to go back to a very exciting story that was very exciting to just an ordinary citizen and not a soldier in general, but to Miles. What happened to him when he got caught between the lines?
Well, this was not Miles, but Daniel.
Oh, Daniel, the son Daniel.
Yes. Daniel, at the time, just before the J.E.B. Stuart took over Munson Hill, Munson Hill was surrounded by the Union forces. And the story is that Daniel's horse had been stolen by one of the Union soldiers. Daniel went to the officer, the captain of the regiment of which this soldier was a member. He didn't get any satisfaction from him. He went to the colonel, and the colonel said, well, we'll get your horse back. The soldier didn't return the horse, so Daniel and a neighbor started looking for the horse, and they located the horse. And while all this was going on, while they were looking for the horse, one of the neighbors came by and said the Confederates are coming toward Munson Hill. They were fleeing with their whole family. They were fleeing on foot, so Daniel gave them his horse. And he went back and got another horse from his stable. And about that time, the Southerners arrived, the Confederate forces arrived. Daniel threw up a white flag as an indicated gesture of peaceful intent. The horse decided he would go somewhere else and headed toward the Union lines, and whereupon the Confederates started firing. The horse dropped dead immediately. Daniel Munson extricated himself, and he too headed toward the Union line, where he was taken captive and imprisoned, and along with others who were captured in the no man's land between the two forces. They were taken to seminary, the Episcopal Seminary on the Seminary Road, just a short distance beyond Bailey's Crossroad, and they were imprisoned on the 3rd floor of this building. Daniel Munson had a legitimate pass from the Union forces to go into Washington, so that was no help to him at that time, because the order had been given to retain all these people until such time as the general who was in charge, General Kearney, came back to camp. General Kearney was so involved in seeing what the Confederates were doing at Munson Hill, that he remained away from camp for about 3 days, and it wasn't until he returned that Daniel Munson and the others who were taken prisoner were released. The others included 2 Union soldiers who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I would think it'd be sort of hard to know who was what. Sometimes we're just walking around. But you forgot to tell them about that newspaper.
Well, there was a newspaper was thrown up by some of the boys who in the neighborhood, and this had an account, Confederate forces capture Munson Hill, and apparently this newspaper article was published worldwide, and it made a great sensation.
So you see, Munson Hill was world news. It had its famous moments.
It disturbed the Union greatly. They were of the impression that a much larger force had been placed there than actually was. The Confederates were quite shrewd, and they only had 1 cannon, and this they wanted to use and for various purposes. So they built what they call Quaker guns by taking wagon wheels from various places that they collected and logs and stovepipes to simulate cannon. And these deceived. From a distance, they looked very much like real cannon and deceived the Union forces.
A very exciting thing happened to your great-grandfather, because in the Battle of Louisville that he left the hill for, he came back and, you know, he got that letter of recommendation, and that's where he became a general.
Right. He was during his initial tour at Munson Hill, we'll call it, he was a colonel, and then it was shortly after that he was promoted to brigadier general.
And they say he celebrated on the hill. Now they say he could celebrate well.
Good reason to celebrate.
He liked to celebrate. But I think these 2 men had a lot of things in common. I really do. I think although they had different beliefs, they both were very religious men. And what's the story, before we go on any further, it would be hard for people to believe, but he didn't ever take a drink.
No, he promised his mother at a very tender age, at her request, that he refrained from imbibing in the spirits. And he kept that pledge to his mother and never drank alcohol, although he tolerated those who did. So I think that shows another side of his character. He was an understanding individual. But even when he was mortally wounded and was dying, he mentioned that he did not want to cross the promise or negate the promise that he made to his mother many, many years ago, that he would never let liquor touch his lips.
And he died so young. He was such a young general. I mean, when people don't realize it, he was 28 when he was on the hill?
That's correct. And was killed at Yellow Tavern, north of Richmond, battling Sheridan's forces who were trying to find a weak point in the southern defenses. Was mortally wounded and died the next day in May of 1864, and was 31 years old at that time.
So young. And Mr. Munson died a year after?
He died in 1867, 2 years after the end of the war.
2 years after the war. There's a new sign that was just put up yesterday down at Munson's Hill, and both names are on it, and it says JEB Stuart on Munson's Hill. And it tells all about the Quaker guns and how they fooled the Union. And I think you can all both be pretty proud of it. And so come on along with us, and we're going to go down to Munson's Hill now and take a picture of the sign.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
JEB Stuart at Munson's Hill. Following the first battle of Manassas on 21 July 1861, Colonel James Uriel Brown Stuart, commander of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, moved his troopers to Fairfax Courthouse and then here to Munson's Hill.
Both armies marched to a different drummer, each thinking that it would be a quick victory for their side. Today, at Munson's Hill, JEB Stuart IV and Munson Lane Jr. can look back at their family history with pride and move forward knowing that the human spirit lives on.